start up and then I'm going to shut it right down.
Got okay. I think they understood.
Yeah. Technology always.
Yeah, I think they are okay.
Or if you go to the YouTube, you should see it now.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Okay.
So
good.
Yeah,
Did I just say the YouTube? Is that I just said the YouTube? Oh, I'm so happy my daughter isn't here to hear that. Oh, Dad. The YouTube, really. I think from what I gather, everybody is I think people are partying in the break room right now, so they should be around in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So everybody, hi Patricia.
Hi.
Hello. Hi. So good to see you all. Now, given that you're only doing sort of a 3-minute little opener, does anybody have any technology that we need to check, or are you just chatting?
No.
No.
Good. That would be generally.
I don't think there would be time.
I have a 15 slide PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to be covering in my 3 minutes. Well, that wouldn't be so far out of my pedagogical practice sometimes, unfortunately. I think it feels like that anyway. Well, thanks very much to all three of you for offering to do openings, because you were carefully selected. But yes, these three are the ones that I would for sure want to lead off this particular discussion. So that's great. Give it another minute. Is it party in the break room, David?
Someone cut it off halfway through. We thought it for sure that the tyrant president was unapproving of our conversation, and because it said meeting has been closed by host, and none of us were the host.
That would have been the tyrant president clicking the wrong link and then leaving the meeting without thinking that, although I didn't intend to end it for all. That's my story. Sticking to it. Great. All right. Well, we have 2 o'clock, so welcome to our last activity, or our last Burkean Parlor of the conference. Wow, I can't believe we're here already, but here we are. So what we'll be doing, if anybody here is new to the Burkean Parlors, the way they work is that we start off with 3 people speaking for 3 minutes, just to get us started off, and they'll give just informal remarks to start us thinking about the topic, after which the floor is open and anybody can speak on the topic. And so it can be freewheeling and free. And of course, you don't have to speak as an authority. If you want to just pose a question, or just add a thought, a personal remark, then more than welcome to do so, because this is the context for it. So our question today is, what are the benefits and issues around applying the term rhetoric to the communication practices of non-Western cultures? So I have you in alphabetical order. Is that okay, or does anybody want to go first? Alphabetical's okay? Okay. Patricia O'Feely, Wendy Shilton, and Andrea Valente will start us off, and we'll start off with Patricia. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The question for this parlor is pretty interesting for me, particularly because my project revolves around the African rhetorical tradition, and I also studied the way Mandela combined the Western and African rhetorical traditions, right, for his rhetoric in the struggle against apartheid. But what I need to talk about is that when the issue with rhetoric when it comes to non-Western communication is that because the term rhetoric, the conceptualization can be traced to the Western rhetorical tradition, it is usually assumed that other, like the African communication modes are not rhetorical, or it's like we kind of like are being, is looked at as either inferior, or you don't attach the term rhetoric to the ways that we communicate. But like I said yesterday, human beings are rhetorical animals, and we deploy rhetoric in ways that we don't even understand. Neither do we deploy rhetoric consciously. It becomes an unconscious way that we deploy rhetoric. But the fact is that the African rhetorical tradition comprises of a system of expression and communication that is derived from the culture and values of the African peoples in songs, dances, rituals, proverbs, folk tales, and also the West African griot or the South African imbonge. That in a way that they are deployed in a way that's actually performative and persuasive. The West African griot is this figure that acts as the repository of African history and culture, and the way they like communicate this culture, it's compelling, and it's compelling in a way that has the community subscribing to whatever it is that they're being told. And so that's because a lot of times, because African rhetorical tradition has been perceived as mainly oral, people tend to forget that there are also written forms that can be traced to centuries, like almost as far back as the Western rhetorical tradition itself. So, but the fact is that the African rhetorical tradition is rich and has a variegated nature that is actually kind of, how do I put it now? Like it helps acquaint the people with their culture through storytelling, praise, singing, poetry, music. And it has a rhetorical dexterity rather, and wit that is compelling and persuasive. And so the benefit is that African rhetorical tradition in itself is old, and it's quite persuasive in the way it is used for communicating with in every aspect of life. I don't want to, there's so much to talk about. When I start, I always I'm struggling to stop because there's just too much to talk about. But I would like to hear from you guys what you think of when you think of African modes of communication in terms of rhetoric, and to know how we have conceptualized the African rhetorical tradition, or if you even think that the African rhetorical tradition is a thing. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Our next speaker is, who's in alphabetical order here? Wendy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to be very maddeningly general here because I got into the same problem that Patricia just mentioned, is that my head is swimming from so many wonderful talks. There's so much I want to think about. There's so many different applications. I couldn't possibly say everything. So now it has become very, very overarching. But I wrote a few words, and I'll just read those. So I'll bring up the document here. So what are the benefits of and issues around applying the term rhetoric to communication practices? My first response, I had three main ones, so I'll just give you those and then I'll go into a little bit of how I'm thinking, particularly in one of my roles at the university here on Prince Edward Island. First response was rather like Patricia just said, absolutely first was that it implies the question to me, who owns the meaning of rhetoric? And helps to resituate Western-based systems of rhetorical study in a rich, complex history of the evolution of knowledge and meaningful communication systems across cultures around the world, many predating the Greek-Roman roots of Euro-Western rhetoric. The second point was that in considering Western-based rhetoric in light of the communication practices of non-Western cultures, insofar as I have experience of this, it offers important opportunities to learn from them, to practice self-skepticism, and to challenge and change problems of cultural and ideological bias rooted in Western logics and rhetorical practices. Is wonderful and very necessary opportunity to learn. And then third, it supports our ability to reimagine and design and implement pathways forward for integrating greater cross-cultural rhetorical awareness and critical practice for 21st century education globally. Just as Patricia said, human expression and communication begin with rhetorical invention and adapt through reinvention, always in response to a specific localized moment. And our global moment is exceptionally complex and difficult right now. This was wonderfully discussed in the Burkean Parlor yesterday. The pandemic in so many ways has exposed how very fragile this planet is and all of life within it. And a great deal of thought and work and change is needed to address the complex ills in multiple interrelated dimensions, because there are dire stressors in our world today in terms of climate and environmental health, human and physical and mental health, socio-cultural and economical and culture and health, food, shelter, and economic insecurities. It's a real crucible moment for me, and I think for many people right now. And the thing is, to recognize a powerful place for more presence and new approaches for rhetorical studies and research collaboration in higher education. Now, I inevitably, I think, approach these huge questions through my rather unique three-part role at UPEI. On one level as a teacher, scholar, faculty member, on another as an administrator, coordinating and supervising various writing programs, including the first-year writing course, and as an instructional leader, promoting writing across the curriculum campus-wide, as well as through liaison with the provincial government and secondary school system. So there's a lot of reach here in terms of the way I see writing across the curriculum, or WAC as the acronym goes, which I insert an R into, RAC, okay? And you know, WR lowercase a and C. And as I argued in my talk the other day, or no, actually, as I argued in a talk I gave at this conference in 2017, I've come to realize how great a need there is to return strong, visible emphasis to the rhetorical turn for effective, globally relevant education and communication practices in general. In that talk, I talked about an essay that had been written by Dilip Parameshwar Gankar, and where he explored the rhetorical turn, which pointed to a rediscovery of rhetoric in contemporary thought. He especially explores those differences with a view to showing how the third phrase, the rhetorical turn, the third phase of the rhetorical turn, repositions rhetoric as a meta-discipline and signifies a radical shift in the self-understanding of Western rhetoric. And it's this rhetorical turn, he says, that breaks from the previous discipline-bound notions of rhetoric, opening up new possibilities for rhetoric. I found this very inspiring, this notion. And okay, for a number of different reasons. First, as a pedagogical practice where rhetoric's no longer viewed merely as a technical discipline for imparting communication skills, the way it is so often treated in first-year composition, but rather as a central medium for creating community, as well as for its traditional purpose in preparing citizens. Second, the rhetorical turn transforms rhetoric from a discursive instrument of politics into the constitutive means of political discourse itself. So here too, rhetorical criticism is the discipline for debunking and demystifying ideologically motivated discourse, including that of Western-based rhetoric. There's something about Geonkar's formulation here that moves me. He says that the rhetorical turn illuminates how tropes are a common feature of ordinary language, seen in many over a number of centuries. Emerson, for example, had argued this in his 1836 essay, Nature. And then later, of course, this reemerges in the embodied theory of cognitive linguists such as George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. Geonkar states that the rhetorical turn treats rhetoric as a living force, not as an historical phenomenon. And in this way, he says, rhetoric framed as a meta-discipline sets out to play the role assigned to it by Richard McKeon in 1971 as the architectonic productive art. That's where I just really apply this notion of rhetoric as an architectonic to the work I'm doing with WAC, because rhetoric isn't just a method of analysis, but also as a tool for improving the quality of life in every domain. And I've worked for more than 10 years with the shift to collaborative knowledge ecologies, not economies, non-hierarchical clusters of teaching and learning across the poetic rhetoric continuum for greater ethical capacity for all purposes. And now I'm turning to the current applications of whole systems theories and approaches to sustainable WAC development with, as I mentioned the other day, the multifaceted dimensions of complexity theory, and systems theory, social network theory, resilience, and sustainable development theory. So just to end this, it's my teaching encounter with Gregory Younging's Narratus Nullius, the essay in his phenomenal book, Elements of Indigenous Style, that prompted a really momentous shift in my consciousness, because I'd been theorizing, I'd been conceptualizing and applying, but not conscious of how much deeper I can and must go with my inclusion of embodied rhetoric in spatial and temporal relation to value and meaning making, and changing how I'll undertake the alliances in my institutional leadership role in WAC, with a far more broadly based, partnered, holistic emphasis on integrating rhetoric across the curriculum, if I can. So that's what I wanted to bring to the table today.
Thank you so much, Wendy. From both statements, there's lots to think about. So Andrew, you're going to add to that.
Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you, Bruce, first for inviting me to this Burkean Parlor. It's my first time. And I'd like to keep the ball rolling here from resuming from what Patricia said and from what you said this morning during your session that was about storytelling, personal narratives inside academia. And that's where it's going to be a little bit of my focus when I was speaking of how to answer this question. I don't have really an answer, but I have some other questions that come upon these ones. So how can we include, different rhetorical communicative practice into the academia? And we know that, storytelling, personal stories, life narratives, these are very common communicative practice in indigenous communities, in non-Western communities. But when we, come to school, go to school, these things become like, no, this is not a space for this type of rhetoric and narrative. But we forget that actually it's not is not that, life stories or a personal narrative or storytelling tradition is not something distant from us. It's very, very much close. We are very much familiar with listening stories since we were born, because this is what the first type of, I believe, rhetorical pattern we are used to, listening stories from our caregivers, right, before going to bed, sleeping stories. So somehow I believe there are some, in our brain, some neuronal networks that have built throughout our early years to understand stories. And then when we go to school, especially starting university, first personal narratives are usually not welcome. So you have it now to start thinking more into arguments, creating structures in your essay, constructing thesis statements. And I see with my students, sometimes I see this is so much distant from them. And how can we understand that this is something now that they have to get familiar with? But at the same time, we have to understand that argumentative thinking, for example, is very important for critical thinking. So how can we balance, how can we create spaces in our classroom that will bring together this storytelling tradition and argumentative traditions that come from the classical rhetoric, right? I'd like also to add here also my own story to rhetoric, because who am I here talking about the rhetoric? I'm sure my story is very different from yours. My first contact with rhetoric was not from the classical rhetoric Aristotelian tradition, but it was in pedagogy of when I was doing some training for ESL writing. When some scholars start in applied linguistics, they start applying, what they call contrastive rhetoric. So it's a comparative study of how, second language speakers of English and English speakers write. So they were comparing, and that was going to back in the 60s with Kaplan's work on contrastive rhetoric, and later on somehow modified and somehow recontextualized in Ulla Connor's and others' work. But I think that is important to have that in mind when we are teaching argumentative writing to students, right? Because they are coming from not only when English is their second language, but also when they are coming from non-Western countries, because then we have language and thought and mind together, right? So in a way, we shouldn't be say one is better than the other, or they have to at the university only to focus on argumentative writing. But how can storytelling be introduced in the writing and become, a way to somehow integrate and create a space that later we can go into more argumentative writing? For example, it's easier for us to start from what we are familiar with, from what we know, and to write about things that are familiar and what you know in a narrative format. But how can then we transition to an argumentative style that's more abstract? I think that if you combine both, we can start creating in a pedagogical way some methods or some tools easier for students to transfer some skills or to move beyond the different writing genre, all right? And even experiencing what it is. What am I doing here, telling my story using first person pronoun? Because we know that in many courses, instructors say, do not use the first person, right? You cannot say I. And we, at least in my courses, I try to include students, no, you are allowed to say I, right? But how are you going to say this I, and how you're going to articulate it? So I think that as you're mentioning this morning, is understanding where the students are coming from, their topoi, their position, and from there creating space to teach argumentative writing. Because one of our goals also is to offer students tools and content skills so that they can grow. grow in terms of content and grows also in terms of their own rhetoric, right? Because we are rhetorical beings. I understand like that. And I also agree with what said here, rhetoric as a living force. So how can we also grow as our own, or be our own, with our own rhetoric? Because I believe that we understand communication and rhetoric as also part of ourselves. So not something that is outside of us, is inside of us. So I hope that I have touched here some ideas for continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all three of you for that great start to this conversation. So we'll now throw it open, and if anybody else has opinions on this, I mean, there must be, some of you must be doing elements of contrastive or comparative rhetoric in your class, or teaching the rhetoric of other cultures. Just any observations that you have in terms of how we do this well. We've got Douglas. Please go ahead.
Thanks, and thanks very much for those great opening talks. It's so much to think about. It's really interesting because I've been far too busy this week with stuff in another society in which I was participating, the Canadian Society of Medievalists. And, you know, it occurs to me that we were engaging with many of the same questions there, especially around reconciliation and indigeneity in medieval studies. I was fortunate enough earlier to be included in a talking circle with a number of folks who are up and coming in applying concepts of indigeneity and indigenous subject positions to medieval studies. And, you know, one of the things that really I brought up, given my interest in rhetoric, and I think we can all profitably think about, is the way in which the Western cultural tradition is still highly combative. I mean, there are still elements of the scholastic disputation in how we do everything. And in my capacity teaching classical rhetoric at Lakehead, that's pretty obvious. Here's where I think that, you know, going back to 99 and Krista Ratcliffe's concept of rhetorical listening can really be quite useful as a way of sort of thinking about how classical rhetoric did embody that, and it wasn't picked up again, and as a good and useful tool into thinking about how other rhetorical traditions, the indigenous one, for example, or the indigenous ones, there's more than one, it really function on consensus and listening as opposed to a combative approach. And that's something that I've been trying to use learning experience design to do, and talked about that over in that society as well. So I think, yeah, Ratcliffe's idea of rhetorical listening is potentially quite useful here as a way into thinking about how other rhetorics work.
I think you're muted.
Anyways, this is a book that I used, and it's so rich and so interesting, Kennedy's comparative rhetoric. But anybody who knows it has probably looked at the table of contents and immediately realized the potentially problematic aspects of the book, which is that it starts off with animal rhetoric, moves on to Aborigine rhetoric, moves on to indigenous rhetorics, goes to China, then to India, then you end with Greek rhetoric. So, you know, you can kind of see, you know, that little diagram of the bent over human being that gradually gets straight. You can almost see it happening in the book in a really problematic way. And so it really made me wonder, you know, about rhetoric and about applying the term rhetoric to the communication practices of other cultures, and how we do it, whether we do it in that sense, whether using the terminology that we do, maybe it's not, I mean, I think it's justifiable in some ways, but I think that there's lots of things that it does that might be questionable. That's just my sort of 2 cents. Wendy? Oh, you're muted, Wendy.
Yeah, thinking about Andrea's comment, it's interesting. I've done quite a lot of work in narrative medicine, and a lot of these insights about the rhetoric as an architectonic has come through that work. And I've appreciated very much all that I've learned, studied, and will continue to. I teach courses in it as well, various kinds of them. And I'm applying some of the theories, Andrea, that I've been learning, for instance, in first year composition. And because I have a role where I am very much in leading curriculum development, as well as working with my colleagues who teach writing, the first year writing course, an academic writing course, is subtitled Writing from the Inside Out. Hardly original, but it gets the idea across, and it's a little bit startling for students, as well as for colleagues in other disciplines, but it's intended to ground students with the development of agency, anchoring their ability to understand themselves as subjects of worthy of investigation and thinking about. And the first assignment is a research project, a very short research project, in which they investigate a problem that they would define as a problem in their lives, and then look at it from multiple points of view. And so there's some real creativity going on in there too, and they learn how to work with that I responsibly. And then they are able to begin to move out through the various modes to the position that a typical composition course would start them in, as they begin to do a kind of subject-object relating. One of the things that we are very, very conscious about doing is integrating reflection as the medium that unites all these different rhetorical modes. And so it's reflective writing on a number of different levels. Arthur Frank's, the sociologist Arthur Frank's concept of companion stories has been very useful, with its roots and branches, that we have root stories, and then branch stories that are related to the root stories. There are so many ways I see parallels with this in Indigenous storytelling. And they learn how to use reflective writing, and there's so much work now done on reflective rhetorics. Yancey's book, for instance, is a very good place to get a nice array there. It really is helping the work that I do with embodied rhetorics, bringing that to story. Because you're right, there's so much very recent neuroscientific study coming out to evidence the claims about the hardwiring, so to speak, of a story, of narrativization in the brain as we move from sensory affective levels of processing through our interactions to, from implicit memory, implicit knowing, to more and more and more conscious, symbolized, objective knowing and abstraction finally. And then it's a recursive dynamic. And that's what the reflective rhetorics as a kind of medium through everything. They must be writing reflectively all the way from the beginning through to the end of the course. So these things, again, it's hardly original, but it's happening. It's happening in academic writing courses.
Thank you. Other people? Does anybody here ever, well, I mean, I know there are people here that do work with indigenous rhetorics and who do work with, African American rhetorics. I mean, how do you position yourself relative to the culture you're working on when you're external to that culture? I mean, I'm not asking for the right answer. I'm asking a real question. Although if you have the right answer, I'd love to know it. Masha? Oh, you're muted.
Here I am. I don't claim to have the right answer, but I think in simplest terms, I position myself as speaking with, not speaking for. So having a very intentional citational practice is also really useful.
What does that look like, that speaking with? Like what practices that, are there that the rest of us might adopt that would, concretely make that happen in our own research?
Should I chime in again? I don't see if there are other hands.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, again, just as an immediate thought, looking beyond the familiar, when I was working on the use of satire and hashtags in relation to Idle No More, there are so many really prominent white, predominantly male scholars in the field of digital rhetoric, and I wanted to think about, are there indigenous theorists, maybe not predominantly working in, discussing Twitter, but can I think about what other voices have really valuable commentary on this particular issue, but they're not the ones that are getting cited at the moment. And I also make it a point to think about, is there something valuable to giving priority to quoting rather than paraphrasing when there are voices that have been excluded from these traditions? We do prioritize paraphrasing a lot for obvious reasons, but sometimes it doesn't feel like a good use of my academic voice to be rephrasing some of these comments. There's like a lot of nuance, I think, at the level of diction, pacing, narrative that gets lost if I just take Leanne Simpson's words and I put them into a more kind of conventional academic discourse. Not to say that Leanne Simpson's work isn't academic, but it's deliberately creative and narrative.
I find it really interesting that narrative seems to be a thread here. Like when we talk about, which is in some senses odd, because narratio is such a basic part of the basic, the forensic setup, and yet it doesn't seem to be as live it seems to be something that when we talk about needing to take into account other modes of communication that exist not outside of rhetoric, but that rhetoric isn't paying enough attention to, that narrative is one of them, or storytelling is one of them. I find that interesting. I mean, Patricia, you alluded to that, the presence of story.
Yeah, I alluded to that, and storytelling is a huge part of the African rhetorical tradition. And there's also something I've noticed, that when I look at indigenous narratives and rhetoric here in Canada, I see a lot of similarities between the culture here amongst the indigenous people and my culture. And this question I was just asking someone is it possible that these people migrated from Africa, or Africans migrated from here? What's going on? Because the similarities are really huge. And something I'm really thinking of looking into. Yeah.
Douglas?
Yeah, I just want to echo what you've all been saying. And Bruce, your idea about narratio, I think, really intersects nicely with what Wendy was saying about neuroscience and its findings around story, and how that might be another common thread, another way in which listening rhetoric might point some things out that are similar or points of connection. The one thing I would like to say, though, too, is that I think moving beyond the very specific notion of thinking about it as academic work, how do you cite this? Thinking about how you live with it, too. And I mean quite specifically the idea of being able to sit with difference and to understand that there aren't going to be matchups all the time. I've been part of a Chinese family for 30 years now, and I've had quite an education. My mother-in-law, who arrived here as part of an arranged marriage, back in '65 as an adult, I remember trying to explain to her what it is I do. And, this is somebody with more A levels from Hong Kong than you can shake a stick at. But the Middle Ages and rhetoric as classically defined make absolutely no sense whatsoever in traditional Chinese culture. They just don't. What does make a lot of sense is the idea of narration, the idea of story. And, living here in Thunder Bay with a family that falls into the category of what Northern Ontario School of Medicine describes as Indigenous seeming, because we have a lot of problems with violence and racism here. And we are not distinguishable from the Anishinaabe people of this place. So we've had some pretty ugly stuff happen to us, like really ugly, but also some great opportunities to find out and point out very specific connections of the kind that Patricia's talking about, whether it's cultural practices around incredibly specific things or just approaches to the whole rhetorical exchange, which seem remarkably similar in Chinese culture and in, say, Anishinaabe culture. So I think that's something we should look for. We should look for those points of connection, those points of sharing, and also be very upfront and very clear about when we're sitting with difference and we don't have those connections, and not make those attempts to speak or to, explain away what we don't entirely understand. And that's a very interesting liminal space to be in, but also a very productive one. I've lived there for 30 years and it works just fine.
Yeah, you brought in mind to me Burke's phrase "rotten with perfection." Like that, if we don't understand something, it's got to be shoehorned in somehow. Like we're partway there. We need to be all the way. That we can't sit with difference, and something to watch out for. Yeah, Andrea, and then Wendy.
Thanks. I also like to think that it's important that we understand that different types of communication, modes of reasoning come together in the space, not one. Now, because what sometimes I'm kind of hesitant is to find that, okay, let's start using storytelling, narratives, and then we just do not explore other types of reasoning, other types of construction in language. So I think that has to be a balance and has to be creating space for different modes of reasoning and modes of structuring the language and so on, and being aware when we are using them and why we are using them, having this metacognitive skill and awareness to know why we're using storytelling at this moment and not an argumentative one, and vice versa, or something else, or even something that could be visual, right? Why am I using a visual to make a certain point rather than using words, all right, or the body or music, as we have seen here? So I think that we have to be somehow careful sometimes not to say, okay, otherwise we become all this fashion, right? Now let's use this type of conversation style or communication style, and then we forget about the others. So that's something that I always, think that we should keep a good number of skills, strategy, and repertoire in communication. Thank you.
I should note that there's quite a rich discussion happening on the side in the chat as well. If anybody wants to check that out, quite a bit going on there. Wendy, please.
Somebody may well have said that there. In any case, I'm responding to Doug's point about the intersections. And one occurs to me, and I mentioned it the other day in a session, the enthymeme. The enthymeme, especially when we're talking about narrative, I think, opens up that unknown space. And we can assume, we can make assumptions in that unknown space. It's a wonderful possibility of possibility, rather than, as I remember years ago, encountering Corbett's definition of the enthymeme, and what you do when you encounter one is attack the vulnerable, right? Good one. But that is what I won't do. And so I think learning to get comfortable, as Doug says, but I'm also thinking of Isocrates and intellectual humility, and that it's so crucial to a pragmatic, to phronesis. And so I'm also thinking of the phrase, don't know mind in Buddhism. And, don't know mind, I don't know. It's just so very hard in Western rhetorics, stereotypically, to admit that you don't know, or you may not be right, or you may test out. It's very hard to use invitational rhetoric. You have to learn, because we're not taught it. And I think all these forms and so many more, we can learn from other traditions and other ways. And we have to, as I say, this cultural moment is crying for it. So.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're just about at time here. We are at time here. So thank you so much for, this wonderful discussion and for the entire conference. So I'm just gonna, I know there's actually on the schedule, there's a 15-minute gap between my closing remarks and this particular session, but I don't think that you want to all go away for 15 minutes and come back. So I'll just maybe close off here if everybody's okay with that. So yeah, I would like to, yeah, David, do you have something, or just yes, go ahead, yes. So I don't want to speak at length, but I do want to thank everybody that has contributed to this conference. And the conference committee, the conference planning committee, the advisory committee that did all the vetting of the proposals, the student awards committee that provided, such wonderful feedback. I was reading some of the feedback, and I know a number of students have expressed to me how valuable that feedback was in terms of making for a better presentation and just forwarding their projects along. So that definitely is, in my knowledge anyway, is not something that very many other societies do, but that sort of feedback, that definition of a university, Newman's definition of a university is a community of scholars. And I find that to be so applicable to this organization, which I've been involved with for probably over a decade now, a very unique sense of community. And I value that a lot. And I know a number of you do as well. So I look forward to continue to build it and deepen it as we move forward. And I'd of course like to thank all of you who have presented. I have been, each conference just seems to me to be overwhelming in terms of the number of ideas and connections and new thoughts that it provides to me. And I hope it's been the same for you. So just an invitation, our AGM is coming up, and I'm going to just double check the date here to make sure that it is the 16th. at 4 p.m. Toronto time. So that's our AGM. We're a pretty small organization that does wonderful things. And we do wonderful, those wonderful things happen because we do them. Like we do them together, all collectively. So I would encourage you to come out to the AGM, and there's plenty of things to do, plenty of committees that people can serve on, plenty of ways to serve, plenty of ways to contribute. But the other thing too is that at the AGM, this is going to be really exciting, which is that as amazing it has been to meet with you online, I don't know about you, but I've been aching to meet in person again. And I think next year is the year we do that. So at the AGM, we will be planning the theme of next year's conference. We'll be talking about the venue for next year's conference. And so that I would love your feedback on that. So I hope you can make it. And if you can't make it, but there's something that you'd like to be brought up or something you'd like me to say on your behalf, please do email me. I'm really, really happy to do that. So with that, we'll call a close to Ret Canada 2022 and look forward to Ret Canada 2023, where I hope to see you all in person. We'll be communicating during the year, but whenever I see you next, I hope you all keep well. And yeah, if there's anything you need or want or any questions you have, ideas you have, please do contact me. So take care. The break room will still be open after this, so you can go there if you want to debrief after this. Take care, everybody, and thanks so much.